is that of the strong versus the weak. And the goal of terror is indeed to foster fear. During his 29 January 2003 Grand Rapids speech, Bush correctly accused Saddam Hussein of just such brutality. Saddam Hussein has terrorized his own people. Unfortunately, Bush quickly transferred Saddam's guilt in abusing his own people to a claim that a terrorist like Saddam must be linked to al-Qaeda's attacks on the United States. In this case, Bush made the illogical and manipulative jump that activity in one form of terrorism was politically and morally the same as involvement in another form. However, al-Qaeda's actions represent a very different kind of terrorism, one that I list under terrorism by groups against regimes and practices. This variety of terrorism reverses the relationship between the terrorists and the terrorized. Instead of terrorism by the strong against the weak, it's terrorism of the weak against the strong. And this category of terrorism is that which most concerns us today. Nationalist, Marxist, and now Islamist terrorist groups cannot match the resources and the power of the governments and populations they assault. In such circumstances, terrorism is often less aimed at instilling fear in the target community of the terrorist enemies than it is intended to win greater support for the terrorists among their friends and their potential friends. How can terrorists do this? In one of absolutely the best articles I've read on terrorism, and by the way, it came out in 1973, before Islamism was really on the map for us. It's by Fromkin, and he points out that terrorism is, as he calls, a sort of jujitsu, the ingenuity of which consists of, and I quote him, using an opponent's own strength against him. The terrorists must find a way by which they can induce the adversary to undermine his own strength and increase the terrorist's power. The answer lies in provoking the adversary to do something that is essentially self-defeating. Instilling fear is not as likely to accomplish this flawed retribution, as is inciting outrage. For the weak terrorists to become stronger combatants, they must increase their resources and their numbers. And the best way to do this is get those they have targeted with terrorist attacks to, as I say, do the work for them. This brings up another absolutely crucial aspect of terrorism. Terrorism is political theater that plays to several audiences. I've already said that, but it's worth restating. One of the problems with definitions of terrorism, such as the two I presented earlier, is that they are written by and for the target audience of victims. Thus, they stress the effect on those attacked by terrorism. However, terrorists also play to those whose support they already enjoy and wish to maintain by demonstrating that they are attacking the hated foe. And even more importantly, the terrorist act is intended to win over a still larger audience of those who are not yet supporters of the terrorists, but who might be brought on board. Should terrorists recruit the uncommitted, they can raise the conflict to a higher, more intensive level. I consider terrorism to be an entry level of war, requiring even less resources and fewer combatants than does a guerrilla campaign. The goal of most terrorists is to escalate the fighting. This would mean first moving up to a full insurgency and then to a triumphal conventional stage of warfare. Ariel Marari, the head of the Center for Political Violence at Tel Aviv University, puts it succinctly. One might say that all terrorist groups want to be guerrillas when they grow up. The most effective way for terrorists to win supporters and recruits and thus evolve is to provoke their adversaries into acts that convince the terrorists' potential supporters of the truth of the terrorists' own narrative, persuading those potential supporters that the terrorists' enemy is their enemy. Consider the most iconic event of the Troubles in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Bloody Sunday, 30 January 1972, when British troops fired on unarmed civil rights demonstrators in Derry, or Londonderry, killing 13 and wounding an equal number. This deadly event had been preceded by a long campaign of attacks by the Provos, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, against the British Army in Derry. Between August and mid-December 1971, the provost fired nearly 2,000 rounds at British troops, killing 7 soldiers. A former provost, Sean O'Hara, explained this strategy, and I'm going to quote him in a minute, but I'm going to moisten my throat before I do that, to make a point. Excuse, it's a long quote, but it's said so well and clearly. By the way, this is a marvelous example of propaganda to incite further violence. This is a priest leading a group of guys bringing a seriously wounded guy back from the battlefield of Bloody Sunday in Derry. Okay. This is a mural based on it. You'll notice they've taken one guy who was helping, turned him into a British soldier standing on a bloody flag that says civil rights. Here's this quote by Sean O'Hara. Things have always been manipulated, always. In 1971, for 6 weeks or possibly 2 months, every single night, we were out agitating. We were out throwing petrol bombs, nail bombs. We were stirring. We were really putting the army under pressure. But we knew the situation was going to happen, right? If we provoked them enough, if we attacked them enough, at some point it wasn't just going to be them shooting at us. It was going to be them shooting at the people. There was a difference between somebody getting shot in a gun battle and some innocent people getting shot in the streets. And we knew the situation had to come in order to escalate the war. That they had to shoot civilians, and we knew that. And we agitated and agitated until we got that. We had to move the violence to a new level, right? And the only way we could do that was causing them to commit the outrageous, to shoot innocent civilians. But this was inevitable. Because if you're going out there and there's riots going on and some people are throwing stones and other people are throwing bombs, at the end of the day, they're going to retaliate. As soon as they shoot somebody, you cry foul, they're shooting innocent people, which in a sense they were, but the situation was engineered. O'Hara further explained how the provost acted when violence from British soldiers was expected. We took our provosts off the streets simply because of pragmatic reasons. We had so few people we couldn't afford at that point to lose any volunteers. They were weak, and if they wanted to move the violence to another level, O'Hara explains, the provost needed the whole situation to be escalated. The thing was always planned. And the provost succeeded. One of their leaders testified, Bloody Sunday was a turning point. Whatever lingering chance had existed for change through constitutional means vanished. Recruitment to the IRA skyrocketed as a result. Events that day probably led more young nationalists to join the provisionals than any